Chicago, forget about it. Coming up on today's episode of the All Aboard Podcast, we talk about ways to get around the Windy City. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your tri-weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who's blessed to have a highly trained railroad audience, and it is great to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees, because the learning never ceases. And for the second time this week, it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. Now, I want to have a little bit of fun today, and I wanted to talk about one of America's most interesting cities that we have been covering from time to time on this podcast, and that is Chicago, the second city, the Toddlin' Town, Chirac, whatever you call it. But why does Chicago matter to us in the rail industry? Well, that's because it's the railroad capital of the world. And it became that because that's where the Eastern railroads, or most of the Eastern railroads, connected largely with Midwestern railroads. And that's interesting because in general, we tend to think about Chicago as being the place where the West begins, at least for those of us who are on the East Coast. But we know that Chicago is very much in the Midwest, although early in the nation's history, when this area was being developed, it really was the West, especially if you were in some place like Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Delaware, you name it. Now, what's also interesting is that while Chicago is the most prominent location where railroads come together, there are several others that are also noteworthy: St. Louis, Kansas City, Memphis, and New Orleans. And what's more, Kansas City in many of the recent years has been the ideal interchange point of choice for your Eastern carriers, which today, of course, CSX and Norfolk Southern, although only Norfolk Southern gets there, and the Western carriers, Union Pacific, BNSF. And that's because a lot of the circuitry that's related to Chicago's railroads, all of the track, all of the delays, you name it, make it a great place for those of us who love to watch trains to see them, but a very difficult place for anything to operate through. Now, what's interesting is to think, well, why did Chicago end up out dominating these places? The best I can tell you is waterborne commerce that was on the Great Lakes, including Lake Michigan, which was there. But also the fact that over time, Chicago really did become an economic capital, very much a second economic capital. And you need look no further than go downtown and see a lot of the large office buildings that are populated by companies like Aon and Boeing. And in years past, you'd have firms like the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific, and so on. Even McDonald's, which for a long time, still based in the area, but for a long time was in suburban Oak Brook Park. Or Oak Brook Park being nearby. That gave you an idea of Chicago's economic prowess. And that is what, in many forms, is what attracted railroads to America's second city. And just a little recap. So for the railroads from the East, by the 1950s, and what I'm trying to do is avoid going through all of the individual names of a lot of the carriers that ended up building there in the first place. You had the Pennsylvania Railroad, which reached it with two different routes: the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago, as well as the Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, and St. Louis. Make sure I get those names right. That is, the first one is what became their main line to Chicago via Fort Wayne, while the second is the famous Panhandle route, which went over a large portion of Ohio and Indiana and actually came into Union Station from the north side, which is hard for many people to believe that Union Station would be served both from the north and the south by the Pennsylvania Railroad. That gives you an idea of why it was one of the owners there. The New York Central, though, it reached Chicago on 3 different routes: the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern, the Michigan Central, and the Big Four. Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis. The Erie came in. The C&O got there twice on the C&O of Indiana, as well as the Père Marquette, which it took over during the Robert R. Young era, the Monon, the Chicago and Eastern Illinois, the Grand Trunk Western, the Wabash, and the Baltimore and Ohio. They all came from the East End. Oh, by the way, let's not forget the Chicago, South Shore, and South Bend, which was an interurban, which of course became a heavy rail, or already was a heavy rail, but a more traditional heavy railroad as time went on. From the north, you have the Chicago and Northwestern, the Milwaukee, the Wisconsin Central, which of course was long allied with the Soo Line, the Duluth South Shore and Atlantic, and of course their erstwhile parent, the Canadian Pacific. Also, you had on the north the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin, and the Chicago North Shore and Milwaukee. And let's not forget, both the North Shore and the South Shore were controlled by the same people, the Insull interest being Sam Insull, who of course gets a lot of credit, or I should say press, for being considered to be an early version of Enron, although of course Insull was eventually found innocent of all of the charges that were levied against him. Now, from the west primarily, you had the Rock Island, Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, the Chicago Northwestern, the Milwaukee, Chicago Great Western, Illinois Central, Wabash, and Santa Fe. And if you're wondering, yes, you did hear the Wabash twice, because the Wabash was one of 2 railroads, the Milwaukee Road being the other, that actually came to Chicago from 2 different directions. And I should say really 3 if we also add the Pennsylvania, and 4 if we were to add the New York Centrals, coming in off the Big Four, which reached Chicago via the Illinois Central that came in from the south. And yes, if it gets a little confusing, that's because it is. And that tells you why Chicago is really, really a great place to watch trains, and always has been. And now, of course, from the south, let's not forget the Illinois Central, as we just mentioned, the Gulf Mobile in Ohio, and the Chicago and Alton. And of course, on the Illinois Central, you also had, as I mentioned, the trains of the Big Four that were coming north. And that is why the Big Four, which later became the New York Central, also shared Central Station space with the Illinois Central until, of course, that station was torn down in the aftermath of Amtrak. So the results of all this are lots of congestion, lots of track, and lots of delays. But like I said, it truly is an area of railroad commerce, and Chicago really did have, railroads really did have a lot to do in building up to Chicago into what it is today. So you're probably wondering, if you've got all of that, how might you avoid it? Well, there are 2 belt railroads, the Belt Railway of Chicago and the Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern. And these carriers do serve an important purpose, which is to connect all the railroads with each other on the outside and also provide a way to get around town. So starting with the Belt Railway of Chicago, it started in 1882, and it currently consists of 28 miles of main track and 300 miles of switching tracks. So that gives you an idea. Most large cities, whether we're talking about Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, and otherwise, if we really do look at them in terms of the direct straight line through them or around them, they don't seem that big. Although when you think about it, though, of course, a city that takes 28 miles to get around, it's probably pretty substantial when you start to think of it in terms of square miles. And that alone should give you an idea to understand how big Chicago really is. Now, the locus of the Belt Railway of Chicago, sorry, it's having a little trouble speaking today, is Clearing Yard. And that is a hump facility, which on its own has 250 miles of track and itself is 5.5 miles long. So think about that, 5.5 miles long for Clearing Yard itself. And Chicago takes 28 miles to get around on the Belt Railway of Chicago itself. So that should tell you, a little idea of how large this railroad is and the impact that it has on the Chicago area. Now, its original parent was the Chicago and Western Indiana. And if you follow us here at the All Aboard podcast, we talk about the CNWI a lot. Part of that's because I, of course, being a lover of Erie, Lackawanna and Dearborn Station, which was the Chicago and Western Indiana's terminal in Chicago, our primary terminal there, was an owner of it, and it obviously operated over its tracks to get to Dearborn Station itself. The Erie originally, and then the Erie Lackawanna afterwards. And actually, I should say the Chicago and Atlantic, which became the Chicago and Erie, and later the Erie itself. Now, that was not the only Erie predecessor. As you know, the original was the New York and Erie, but later on, the Chicago and Atlantic was the Erie's extension into Chicago, and now, unfortunately, mostly no longer exists. But the Chicago and Western Indiana was the original parent, and both carriers were chartered by a man named John Brown. Now, the early owners included the Louisville, New Albany, and Chicago, which became part of the Monon, Chicago and Indianapolis and Louisville, the Chicago and Atlantic, of course, that's the Erie, Chicago and Eastern Illinois, the Wabash, St. Louis and Pacific, which is the Wabash, and the Chicago and Grand Trunk Railway. And at some point, we will talk about on a separate episode the Grand Trunk and all of the carriers that went into it. So if you follow enough, you'll hear about the Grand Trunk, which is generally seen as much more of a New England and Eastern Canada focused segment of it. And then, of course, the Grand Trunk Western, which is what we know in Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois as being the erstwhile subsidiary of Canadian National, that for many years was their entry into the Windy City. But the Grand Trunk was originally supposed to be exactly what its name says, a Grand Trunk that would link New England with the Midwest, which in a way it did, but also its bankruptcy ended up setting the stage for creating Canadian National and the nationalization of some of Canada's railways and a lot of the arrangement of the assets that we think about today when we talk about Midwestern railroad routes. Now, those were the early owners of the Belt Railway of Chicago, but later that was expanded to include the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Sault Ste. Marie, not the Milwaukee Road, the Soo Line, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, Illinois Central, Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific, the Pennsylvania, of course, the Chesapeake and Ohio, and later on the Père Marquette. So that ended up demonstrating how just about every railroad that is involved in Chicago was an owner of the Belt Railway. And now today it is partly owned by all 6 of the Class 1 carriers that remain: CSX, Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific, BNSF, and Canadian National. One of the most interesting things about the Belt Railway of Chicago for many years was its eclectic mix of motive power, and that included Alco C424s, I believe, Jeeps, you name it, and they were all painted in a very attractive scheme: gray, black, and yellow. And so if you were anywhere around Chicago, you were always looking out to see the Belt Railway of Chicago, and it continues to grind along to this day, providing a very important service of helping its parent railroads bypass the city of Chicago. Now, the second of these belts is the Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern, and that followed the Belt Railway of Chicago by a few years when it was founded as the Joliet, Aurora, and Northern Railway, and that started operating in 1886 between Joliet and Aurora, Illinois. Aurora, of course, most notably identified with the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and being at the end of the so-called racetrack where BNSF operates commuter service today, and then Joliet being very closely associated with the Santa Fe and the Rock Island, them both passing through there, as well as the Gulf Mobile and Ohio. Now, the EJ&E itself was incorporated in 1887 after J.P. Morgan, people in his orbit, got involved. And then in 1898, it came under the ownership of Federal Steel. Now, in 1901, Federal Steel was swept into a company we've all heard of called U.S. Steel. And so it became a subsidiary of U.S. Steel, and it stayed that way from 1901 until 1988 when it was transferred to Transtar. And Transtar was a way that U.S. Steel was partially spinning off a variety of the railroads that it owned, and it owned quite a bit. Some of them were smaller and just served plant areas. Some of them were a little bit larger, like the Bessemer and Lake Erie, the Elgin, Joliet Eastern, and the Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range. And those carriers were known for not only serving facilities, but also serving areas where raw materials such as iron ore and coal were mined and then moved to locations where steelmaking took place. Now, Transtar was later sold in various parts. And when I say various parts, not a piece here and a piece there, I mean just portions of the equity, to the Blackstone Group. And the Blackstone Group had extensive experience with railroading because they worked with Union Pacific also in the 1980s to buy out the Chicago and Northwestern and take that company private. So eventually Blackstone purchased all of Transtar, and there was another shuffle where some of the railroads that were put into Transtar were actually sold back to U.S. Steel, and they were kept primarily for plant-focused operations, where some of the larger railroads, in this case, being the EJ&E, Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern, along with the Bessemer and Lake Erie, Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range, and IM and the Great Lakes Fleet, those remained in Transtar, and ultimately Transtar itself was sold to the Canadian National. Now, why do we bring that up? That's because Canadian National wanted primarily the EJ&E. And it wanted it because by the time it purchased it, and that deal closed in 2008, the Canadian National now controlled the old Wisconsin Central, or I should say the second iteration of the Wisconsin Central, which owned the original Wisconsin Central track that had long been part of the Canadian Pacific and Soo line. And that was the primary way that Canadian National got into Chicago from the Northwest. Remember, it had long been able to get in there from the east on the Grand Trunk Western, but now it was able to get in on the Northwest. They also controlled, by that point, the Illinois Central, having taken that over in the 1990s. So they had a line going from the south. And then, of course, you had the Grand Trunk Western coming from the east. Well, this is great, but how are they going to effectively move trains from one property to the other and realize the benefits of all these acquisitions? Well, the answer, of course, was to buy the Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern. And in all likelihood, since it was owned by Transtar, and I don't have anything to corroborate this, but generally going by how a lot of private equity investors tend to work, a great way in order to accomplish that deal is to force them to buy all of the railroads that were part of Transtar as opposed to selling it piecemeal. And so therefore that is how CN came to own the disconnected BNLE, which doesn't connect anywhere with their system except through the Great Lakes Fleet, which they themselves cannot operate because they are a Canadian company, and those are U.S. flagged ships. So I believe they run afoul of the Jones Act. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that there is a law in there which requires someone else. So they have long contracted with an American firm to operate those assets, the Great Lakes Fleet, which are lake boats. And then, of course, the Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range, which is tied into the a portion of their system with connections to the Duluth, Winnipeg, and Pacific, which was another portion of CN's entry into the upper Midwest. So the EJ&E served this purpose and basically now allows the carrier to come in north of Chicago, move its trains around the city, and then get to its other properties, the Illinois Central and the Grand Trunk Western, by without having to do very much in terms of going through the heart of Chicago and dealing with all the delays and the like that can come about. Another belt line that we never, ever want to forget about, and I almost did simply because once in a while, I'm not perfect. I'm only 99.9% perfect here on the All Aboard podcast. And that, of course, is the Indiana Harbor Belt. The IHB is very well known for its blue and orange diesels, and the IHB for a long time was a subsidiary of the the New York Central and the Milwaukee Road, and later on this became the Soo Line and Conrail. And that played an important role, at least supposedly, in the efforts by E. Hunter Harrison to take over, believe it was Norfolk Southern when he was at Canadian Pacific, because Canadian Pacific having a large stake in the Soo Line, actually owning the Soo Line, but having a large stake in the IHB, this would have been a way that he could have pulled off something similar by having control of a belt railroad to be able to get traffic from Canadian Pacific on the western side, northwestern side of Chicago, coming down on the old Milwaukee Road and being able to move it relatively expeditiously onto Norfolk Southern lines that he was hoping to take over. But of course, this did not happen, and therefore, control never took place. And that's because control of the IHB is actually under Conrail and not under either CSX or Norfolk Southern itself. And that made things rather interesting during the effort to do that takeover. So there you have it. And that's also one of the ways that Conrail today not only counts itself as a short line operator in Detroit, New Jersey, and Philadelphia, but also counts itself as a short line operator in Chicago because it does manage the Indiana Harbor Belt, like I said, coming from the New York Central and the Milwaukee Road in that era, but being part of Conrail for many years, and operates that railroad, and many of its executives you will see come from the ranks of Conrail or CSX Norfolk Southern via Conrail. In fact, I do remember after the original Conrail takeover, you saw a fair amount of people who didn't quite make it to one of the parent companies, new parent companies, moving on over to the IHB before ultimately leaving the industry, or at least leaving the Class 1 portion of their careers. Now, there were a couple of others that I wanted to get to. One is fairly interesting, the Kankakee Belt, and this ran between South Bend, Indiana, and Zering, Illinois, and it was originally named the Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. And why are we bringing this up? Well, going from South Bend, Indiana, which is, of course, east of Chicago, to Zering, Illinois, which is west of Chicago, and almost on the border of Iowa, basically allowed the New York Central, who came to take over the Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa, an incredible way around the city. And at the western end, it connected with the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, but it also managed to meet the Milwaukee Road, and most notably, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe at Streator, Illinois. During the Conrail era, Conrail would use this connection as a way to partially avoid Chicago, not fully, because they would still have to come in, because they did tear up a very substantial portion of the Kankakee Belt, specifically between South Bend and Wheatfield, Indiana. And so it basically does end now at a power plant near a wheat field, whereas in the past it also went to the east and connected with other railroads, including the Pennsylvania and the Erie. Of course, the Erie largely being torn up and the Pennsylvania being de-emphasized. So this link, however, was very, very important for the movement of grain, because a lot of the grain that was coming out of the Midwestern area, of course, Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, and so on, would end up moving over this line to points east on the New York Central. And there was a Supreme Court case that was related to rates, Meshling barge lines versus U.S., and that was decided in 1964, and we will discuss that as well as several other rate cases in a future episode. I always found it very interesting that the Kankakee Belt was not retained in its full form by Conrail, because you would have thought, if their goal was ultimately to expand intermodal service, as they did in many ways, that you would want a way to avoid Chicago. What's so notable is that the most prominent of all of the trains that operated transcontinentally, which was called on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, QNYLA and QLANY, and then on Conrail was TVLA going westbound and TVLT going eastbound, did not use the Kankakee Belt. They actually went into Chicago, took some of the train off cars that were going to Chicago, and then took the rest of it and transferred it to the Santa Fe, which I would say is probably the most clunky way you could go about this, despite having an amazing connection through Streator, Illinois, where you could basically run the train in, go south to the Kankakee Belt, and then go west Streator and continue on the Santa Fe, and save times, perhaps even half a day of travel, depending on how long trains get stuck in Chicago. But that was certainly not done with TVLA, QNYLA, but it does make you think about what might have happened had there been an effort to really make use of that trackage. And now the final belt that we want to talk about is a belt that's never actually operated, and it's called the Great Lakes Basin Railroad. And the Great Lakes Basin Railroad is a proposed railroad that would run from the LaPorta and Panola areas in northwestern Indiana, so not far from Michigan City, and then go down just north of Kankakee before coming up through Rochelle, Illinois, and ending just on the edge of Winnebago County outside of Chicago. So you could think of this as the outer belt, whereas the EJ&E is the outer belt. This would be the outer belt around Chicago. Now, the interesting thing about this is this group of investors has been active over more than a decade and making a lot of noise about their efforts to build this belt. And as usual, it managed to catch the hackles of a lot of citizens, in large part because one of the ways they wanted to secure the right-of-way was by utilizing eminent domain. Now, one unfortunate part of railroading that was not cured by the ICC Termination Act of 1995 was the need to ask the Interstate Commerce Commission or its successor, the Surface Transportation Board, for permission to build a railroad line, an interstate railroad line. And so they did, and they were denied, and they were largely denied for financial reasons, most notably that they had something like $151 in their bank account or in net assets when the examination was done. And they kind of looked down and scoffed and said, well, hey, you people don't have any shot of building a railroad. Now, I think that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because one of the things that you'll learn if you try to do any sort of large industrial project is when it comes to getting investors on board, a lot of these investors are going to need to see that there is the capability to actually do what you're doing. Not that you yourself as the entrepreneur need the financial capability, because after all, that's why you're seeking outside investment, but that there's not going to be unnecessary roadblocks put up by the government. And so, for example, if they were able to get a large investment from, whether we're talking about a venture capital firm, which is not likely to do it, but at this day and age, you never know, given companies like SoftBank that are out there, or we're able to line up equity investments from shippers, railroad connections, and so on, who may very well end up being big fans of this as time goes on, although at this point they will certainly not say so. You would probably end up in trouble if the next thing that happens is you go to seek approval from the Surface Transportation Board and they say, well, hey, sorry, look, we're not interested. And they can still do that for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with the merits of the project. And yes, this is kind of a diatribe on me criticizing the Surface Transportation Board and the ability of a so-called independent regulatory agency to capriciously make decisions about how millions and billions of dollars in capital will be used. But that is what the law does allow in the current regulatory climate, even though that is far better than what it used to be under the Interstate Commerce Commission. Now, the question is, will the Great Lakes Basin Railroad ever be built? The answer is, I don't know. It does remain to be seen what the future of railroading overall is going to look like, and if something like the Great Lakes Basin is going to be necessary. After all, since we are now in an era of precision scheduled railroading, which generally means fewer trains, fewer but longer trains, it is possible that you might continue to see a decrease in the number of actual train starts that take place on a given day, meaning that something like this, an additional belt line, might be unnecessary. However, we also are seeing efforts to continue to grow the passenger rail franchise by a lot of the government agencies who do end up owning and funding those trains. That may create a situation where you do, even with fewer train starts, desire to have another belt, and maybe this idea can be revived. But as I said, in 2017, the Surface Transportation Board said no. However, as we know, even though the regulatory structure may be flawed in terms of it being too restrictive, this also does not mean that it is a no forever. And certainly if the people behind the project do end up with what the Surface Transportation Board deems to be the financial wherewithal and financial projections that they like, then it very well could go forward in some form. And I'd certainly like to invite the folks that are involved with this on the program, and we will endeavor to get them on, because this is something that I think is very exciting. And if it ever does get built, the fact that we will have seen a major railroad built during our lifetimes, major brand new railroad built during our lifetimes, is something that is very, very significant. Now, we will be back on Friday to give a little week in review about what went on news-wise, number one, and number two, in the marketplace, stock markets, bond markets, and so on, with railroads and also rail shippers. That's something we're going to do increasingly here on the All Aboard podcast, because obviously we have important topics to discuss, such as railroad bypasses around Chicago and how those tend to interact with a lot of the railroad names that we know. But we also need to make sure we're staying abreast of what the news is in the current day and how that impacts things such as the railroads that operate into Chicago and the railroad customers that rely on those very same railroads. Now, as always, if you ever do have any ideas as far as topics are concerned or anything that you would like to see here on the All Aboard podcast, please do let me know what you would like to see, and we will make sure to add that to our list. So thank you for being with us. We will see you down the main line, and I hope you have a great day.